All right. Well, I would like to thank everyone for our second of the 2021-22 academic year Miller Reeves lecture series. Today, our top, and if you don't know, the Miller Reeves lecture series is named after two longtime members of the social sciences department, Kent Miller and Quinton Reeves, who both taught political science from around 1973, about 5-10 years ago, depending upon when they retired. We wanted to honor them for their long-term service. Now, today, our presentation is going to be by our new professor in social sciences, our political science professor, Stewart. And just to give you a little background on Jared, he earned his bachelor's degree in political science from University of Central Arkansas. He earned his Master of Arts from University of Washington in political science as well, and he is completing his PhD from the University of Washington in political science. He also gave me some other information, including he's devilishly handsome, quite the scamp, and should not be trusted at all. All right, so.
Hey, the last one, you improv'd.
Yes, I did improv that last part.
All right.
But it is in fact accurate. All right, with that being said, let us learn about populism and presidential political rhetoric.
All right. Well, first off, thank you, Scott, and thank you for everyone that is with us today. Am I ready to, perfect. All right. So it looks like I'll be large soon. All right, thanks everyone for joining us today. It's a beautiful day outside, so thank you for spending some of your Zoom time with us. A little bit about myself. Scott sort of already gave you some of the logistics. I am Jared Stewart. It is my first semester here at Weatherford College. Absolutely in love with this place and the people. It's been a lot of fun. So I want to thank Scott for giving me the opportunity to share some of my work with y'all today. So I'm going to share this with you and hopefully everyone can see all right. All right. Hopefully that is pulled up. So to give you a little bit of background on this project and sort of how I got interested in this, when I was at the University of Washington, Seattle, I started this project looking at presidential debates and how different candidates were using outsider language in debates to appeal to the people, right? To valorize themselves and to appeal to the people. And so this sort of became an extension of that project, looking at populist rhetoric and presidential campaigns. And so I playfully titled this one Hindsight in 2020 and Beyond. I told my wife I was going to make this as complicated of a title as possible, and I think I almost nailed it. So that's sort of the background for this talk. I've always been fascinated by presidential elections. 2020 was fascinating for multiple reasons. And so that's sort of what led me down this road today. And so let's look at some background from the last couple of elections to sort of see what this looks like. So the 2016 election was most certainly marked by the success of populist candidates like Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. Talking heads on TV throughout the 2016 election would say, oh, well, we've got this populist messaging, these populist candidates. It was a really big talking point on TV. And then 2020 rolls around, and it's another election marked by populist candidates, Donald Trump. And did I fall asleep for 4 years? It seems as though 2016 and 2020 are almost repeats of each other in that populism, this populist rhetoric, especially by Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, was very, very prevalent. So how is it that you can have two candidates so very, very different in Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump both be labeled populist? So hopefully we can take a look at that and sort of see how those that contradiction can be addressed. So just a couple examples here of some different language and different rhetoric employed by both of these individuals. My students know I do awful impressions of presidents and campaigns, so forgive me, but I'm going to try this. Donald Trump. This is a direct quote from him, right? So talking about populism being this us versus them. The drug companies probably have the second or third most powerful lobby in this country. They get the politicians, and every single one of them is getting money from them. Very clearly, right? Pitching us as the people against these corrupt drug companies. Bernie Sanders, in the same respect, During the financial crisis, the middle class of this country bailed out Wall Street. Now it's Wall Street's turn to help the middle class. It's hard to get the good response on the impressions not being in the room. But what you see is a lot of similarities in the tone here. Both candidates are sort of pointing towards this evil them and this valorized us. So if you can take two characters so diametrically opposed, like Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, and you can label them both populists, what does that mean? What does that mean for the term? What is populism? The teaser for the talk today, I said populism doesn't exist. That was purposely a little bit provocative, right? Populism does exist, but what I'm going to propose to you today is that it doesn't exist in the sense that many believe it exists as an ideology. So when we think about ideologies, and if you look at the literature on ideologies, there's some things that they all have in common, right? Ideologies are coherent. There is a set of core elements that you can look at and say, hey, this ideology is comprised of this. It's clear, it's obvious. There's agreement for the most part on what elements make up an ideology. For instance, liberalism. Generally, we have this accepted idea. Liberalism includes these ideas of equality, human rights, the prevalence of democracy, popular sovereignty. Conservatism, this ideology, this set ideology, believes in free enterprise, private ownership, unregulation or deregulation of the markets. Progressivism, government action, right? Take action to help address inequality. These are actual set ideologies that we can point to and say these are coherent. They have core elements. The problem is when we look at populism, we don't have that. We don't have that clarity. We don't have a set of core concepts that we can point to and say, populism, I found it. So what is it? I'm not alone in this. I'm not alone in thinking that maybe populism was a little more complicated. So going through the literature and taking out some of the distinct parts of populism, there are some things we can agree on. There are some aspects of populism that aren't terribly controversial. Number one, it is very much about the existence of two distinct classes in any society. American populations, European populations, you name it. There are two classes. There are the people and the elite, right? The people, we generalize them as good. They're valorized. The people are us, right? They're the salt of the earth sorts of people. And then the elite are the evil. They're bad, they're rich, they're powerful. And in this sort of framework, we can shift who them is, right? So maybe the elite is the government. Maybe the elite is big drug companies. The elite can change. And another aspect of populism that we all agree on is that this relationship between the people and the elite is not pretty. It's antagonistic. It has to be antagonistic in order for there to be a tension between these two classes, these two groups. And then finally, one principal tenet of populism is this popular sovereignty, is that the people should rule. So that you've got two classes, the people and the elite. People are good, elite are bad. The two fight it out, and that ideally the people should win. That's sort of the agreed upon tenets of populism that we can work with. Not enough to make a real ideology, but something that we can use. So if you look at a lot of different populist literature, Margaret Canavan, Michael Kazin, all of these scholars look at populist messaging and try to see how people use these themes, these populist themes, to get a political message across. And so I'm going to propose that a political message has 5 key components here. And the first one is pretty key for us right now, which is a populist message usually is a reaction to a crisis or a perceived crisis. The crisis is important here. In order to mobilize the people, you have to have something that they are afraid of, or something that they're passionate about, something that moves them, essentially. And a crisis is really convenient for this. Oftentimes you see populist messages pop up in the wake of things like economic collapse. So for instance, the Great Depression, right? A huge economic crisis for the United States. FDR, coming out of that, framed these populist messages in a sense of we have to protect the people. So a real crisis, a pandemic, a war, something like that, can very much be part of a populist message. The second part of this is a little more complicated. Perceived crisis. It's not necessary that a crisis be a real crisis to be perceived as something important to the people. So, for instance, in 2016 and in 2020, one of Donald Trump's big campaign themes was that there was an immigration crisis at the border. Now, mind you, there were issues at the border, processing folks coming in. There were holding areas, obviously a lot of problems at the border. But the way that Donald Trump spoke about it was that there were caravans of immigrants coming in, that the border was in danger, that action had to be taken immediately in order to stop this. Now, was the situation at the border as bad as President Trump was portraying it? Probably not. But this perceived crisis was very effective. Donald Trump was able to use this messaging to call for wall funding, to call for more National Guard troops down along the border. So a crisis or a perceived crisis is a really useful way to mobilize folks around an idea. A second element here is that the user of this, or the adopter of this populist message, will define themselves as the defender of the people. Because why wouldn't you? If you're the defender of the people, you're their warrior, you're their champion. And in this populist messaging, you want to be seen as the one to deliver the people from this crisis. You're the one with the answers. Maybe you would even have a candidate just hypothetically say something like, I'm the only one that can fix it, right? By portraying yourself as the champion of the people grow this attachment to you. They begin to see you as their champion. And in doing so, you bring up the third element of this populist message, which is you want to make every issue an issue of us versus them. Because that's how you do it. You make it the people versus the elite. And you can take virtually any issue in American politics and see how this has been done in political campaigns. Immigration was obviously a good example of this. Abortion, taxes, everything essentially can come down to this people versus the elite. You see this right now in healthcare, right? A lot of folks are sort of pitching this whole healthcare debate in the United States as the healthcare elites versus the people without insurance. And there's a lot of truth to that, but there's also a lot of power in that messaging, saying that folks are dying and getting sick because the rich elites are buying another yacht. That's sort of language, right? And that sort of ties into the next element of this populist messaging, is that you want to paint political issues as black and white as possible, because people don't respond well to complexity, right? In a message like this, in a populist message, there's an expression I used to hear all the time, KISS, K-I-S-S, keep it simple, stupid. You want to keep your message simple, to the point, so that people respond to it. With a populist message like this, there's not a lot of room for nuance. You want to say, this is right, this is wrong. Because if there's any wiggle room, then people aren't going to be as passionate about it, right? It's black or white, not 50 shades of gray. So you want to use this sort of simple, straightforward language. So that's our last element here. In order to talk to the people, use the people's language. Speak directly to them. So I've got a tweet down here by Donald Trump. The fake news media, failing at New York Times, CNN, NBC News, and many more, is not my enemy. It is the enemy of the American people. Sick. Short, to the point, simple. It couches the issue as these media elites against the American people. And he, in a sense, is sort of a martyr, but the champion of the people in this. So this gives us a sense of what these populist messages look like and the different elements that you can look for. Now, there has been some debate in the literature about populism as a certain kind of discourse. There's a lot of literature on that. I'm going to give you a few different here, and I've got all of these references available for anyone who's interested in this and wants to look more into it. So what I've bolded here are terms that I think are going to help our conversation moving forward, thinking about how populism can be used as a discursive frame. So from Betts 2002, populism is primarily, a political strategy whose political rhetoric is the evocation of latent grievances and the appeal to emotions provoked by them. So again, important points here, appeal to emotions, it's a strategy. Same thing with Wayland, right, or Wieland. Populism is political strategy through which a personalistic leader seeks or exercises government power based on direct, unmediated, uninstitutionalized support from large numbers of mostly unorganized followers. So a political strategy with a personalistic leader. And then the last one here, this is Aslanitis. This is a great piece on populism. Stands for a behavior that fulfills a specific political function, which can then be either employed strategically or asserted as a matter of conviction, i.e., put on the mantle of ideology. What I'm going to claim here is that populism, rather than being a set ideology, is a useful vehicle. It's a useful discursive frame for talking about other ideologies. And so when we're looking at this, right, we're talking about a political strategy, a personalistic leader, how to move your voters, and how to use an ideology. So what I'm proposing here is that instead of an ideology, the populism is this concept that you can use as a vehicle for other ideologies. And that this crisis or perceived crisis is sort of the match that lights the dynamite in a sense. So rather than populism being its own set ideology with its own set rules, I would posit instead that populism is used to deliver, if you will, these ideologies here, both left and right-wing ideologies. Socialism, progressivism, liberalism, anarchism on the left side. On the right, nationalism, fascism, conservatism. What I'm going to suggest is that these actual set ideologies with rules and elements that everyone agrees on for the most part, these ideologies are able to use this populist framework, this populist discourse to get its own ideas across. And so I think it might be helpful to see this play out in real time and with some real examples. So 1896, we're going back pretty far here. William Jennings Bryan, known as the Great Commoner, an incredible orator, a fantastic public speaker. But during William Jennings Bryan's time, you've got the Gilded Age and you've got the Panic of 1893. There's an incredible amount of economic inequality and economic uncertainty. A lot of space between the classes here. And in the midst of all of this, William Jennings Bryan, big push is for progressivism, this progressive movement, protecting the people, using the government powers and the government functions in order to address some of this inequality. And some of the different things he wanted out of government: a federal income tax, a ban on corporate money in campaigns. Progressives have been, barking up that tree, fighting that fight for a very long time. And a quote from William Jennings Bryan here, sort of speaking to this rhetoric. This quote here, look how he couches himself, look how he couches the elite, the people within this crisis. All of it very much meets the sort of criteria we're looking for a populist message. But what he's calling for are very much progressive ideas. We will answer their demand for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. You've probably heard the speech before, the cross of gold speech, incredibly popular right throughout history. But he makes it very clear here to them, right? This crown of thorns that you're putting upon labor, us. It's very clear the two sides he's delineating here. And again, the underlying thrust of this is very much this progressive idea. Skipping forward a little bit, 1976, you've got Jimmy Carter, right? I'm going to do a terrible Jimmy Carter, forgive me. But Jimmy Carter, one-term Democratic president, comes on after a pretty tumultuous period history. we've got Vietnam, we've got the fallout from Watergate, we've got economic issues in the late 70s, we've got what's happening with Iran, lots of things, lots of crises going on. And Jimmy Carter, when he runs in 76, he runs as an outsider peanut farmer from Georgia, right? Just a simple man from Georgia. And he runs, and he really is pushing for a lot of these progressive ideas, mostly transparency in government, coming after the Watergate, the Vietnam fiascos, and pushed and failed, but pushed for consumer protection legislation. Carter came into office with a lot of progressive ideas and couched these again in this populist framework. So this is a great quote, sort of, again, using Carter's populist rhetoric. The deep discouragement of the American people about the performance of public officials in the aftermath of Vietnam and Cambodia and Watergate and the CIA revelations, people have felt that they've been betrayed by public officials. It was actually a decent Carter. Betrayed by public officials, making this very clear, this American people versus these elite government officials that are shady and crooked. Again, the language makes a lot of sense here. Ronald Reagan in 1980, all of these are candidates that use this sort of populist rhetoric. The crises in 1980, you've got the economic uncertainty we were just talking about. You've got social changes. A lot of folks in 1980 are uncomfortable about what's happened in the 60s and the 70s. You see the rise of the religious right in the 1980s. So in a sense, there's sort of a cultural shift back towards traditionalism, back towards conservatism. And Ronald Reagan was the mentor for it. He was the figurehead of that movement. And so Ronald Reagan, very much a very skilled orator and well-liked by the people, could take up that mantle of champion of the people and espouse these conservative ideas. So during the 1980s, we saw this, deregulation throughout, this return to power to the states, this balance of federalism, a return to traditional values. All of this is Ronald Reagan sort of espousing these conservative ideas, but doing it in this us versus them sort of populist framework. For instance, this is his quote. "Well, I've been privileged to meet people all over this. They're not the masses, or as the elitists would have it, the common man. They're very uncommon individuals, each with his or her own hopes and dreams, plans and problems, and the kind of quiet courage that makes this whole country run better than just about any other place on earth." He was so optimistic. He's so incredibly optimistic. He's really just saying the common man are the heroes in this country. And he made that the cornerstone of his governance. That idea was that, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. And those are scary words. So again, he's feeding the country this conservatism, but it's going down really smooth with this populist pill that it's in. Skipping forward a little bit more, I'm a huge fan of elections. 1992, I could have gone with Bill Clinton on this one because Bill Clinton also used populist language. But Ross Perot is just more fun, quite frankly. Ross Perot is more fun. So Ross Perot, for those who are of a certain age and were fortunate enough to get to see Ross Perot run, billionaire businessman from Texas, very strange fellow, but launched a pretty successful third-party run in 1992 against George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. And Ross Perot, even though he was a billionaire businessman, sort of positioned himself as a populist in the race. The crises at the time were essentially the same crises that Bill Clinton was running against. There was a flagging economy. The economy wasn't doing as well as everybody thought it should be. There was racial tension. There were riots in LA. So the country, it's got a lot going on. And Ross Perot, rather than trying to make his way up through one of the major two parties, decides to launch the Reform Party, start his own party, run as a third candidate. And in doing so, he did something pretty bold. He didn't go the normal route of campaign commercials and coming on TV and doing the slick things. Ross Perot would go directly on TV with charts and graphs and explain to the American people why his ideas were better. And he would get these graphs and he would just go step by step. And if you listen to his ideas, a lot of these ideas were very progressive in nature. He was talking about things like campaign finance reform. He was talking about lobbying reform, making sure that lobbyists couldn't go through this revolving door of government backing into lobbying. Anti-NAFTA, he was against these sort of these trade deals that might hurt American workers and American producers. Again, a Texas billionaire, very progressive ideas. And he would buy his own TV time to explain to the American people what his plans were. It was great. See, we have a strange situation because we have a process in Washington where after you've served for a while, you cash in, become foreign lobbyist, make $30,000 a month, then take a leave, work on presidential campaigns, make sure you got good contacts, and then go back out. It's very clear what he's saying here. He is talking about how this Washington lobbyist system does not work for the American people. Again, calling for progressive reforms, but this is very much an us versus them populist framework that he's using to do so. Getting more recent, 2008. I hope what you're seeing here is that this populist messaging, this populist framework is not owned by one party. It's not a Republican thing. It's not a Democrat thing. It's not even a one-person thing. All sorts of candidates try to use this framework to espouse whatever their underlying ideology is. 2008, Barack Obama. You've got a lot of crises going on. You've got the Iraq War, Afghanistan. We're going through a huge economic recession. The country's morale is pretty low. Barack Obama is a pretty revolutionary candidate and comes along and has a very hope and change sort of campaign theme. And underneath all of this is this underlying liberalism, right? He's calling for greater regulation of the economy, of Wall Street. He called for universal health care, tried to push for it, didn't quite get there, called for expanded LGBTQ rights. If you look at a lot of his underlying ideology, it is liberalism. But when he's selling this idea, when he's couching his liberalism within a larger sort of context, he's selling it to the American people using this populist framework. He says, and when you look at your tax policies that are directed primarily at those who are doing well, and you are neglecting people who are really struggling right now, I think that is a continuation of the last 8 years, and we can't afford another 4. Your tax policies directed primarily at the rich, while the poor are struggling and suffering. He's calling for liberal changes, liberalism sweeping through government. But he's doing so by saying, hey, you, the people, you're not getting a fair shake. It's all right. I'm going to help. And now we get in the last couple cycles. These are the only cycles I can talk about to my students that they actually have any sort of knowledge of or understanding of. 2016. I could have either put Bernie Sanders in 2016 or in 2020, same thing with Donald Trump. But 2016, Bernie Sanders runs this almost quixotic campaign, for the Democratic nomination, and does really well, challenges Hillary Clinton, much to her chagrin. The crisis at the time, we've got growing class inequality, something that Bernie Sanders has been talking about for years and years. And we've got healthcare crises, right? Obamacare did some good. The Affordable Care Act did some good. There are still some problems that need to be ironed out. And so Bernie Sanders, an unashamed democratic socialist, very much uses his populist messaging to try to sell all of these ideas. Raising the tax rates for corporations, free education, free healthcare, you name it. When Bernie Sanders talks about these issues, when he's espousing these democratic socialist ideas, he's not saying, come and be a democratic socialist with me. He's saying these ideas are good for the people, but the elites don't want you to have them. Vote for me, I'll fix it, I'll be your champion. So down here, this is Bernie. Democratic socialism means that we must create an economy that works for all, not just for the very wealthy. I didn't want a picture of Bernie because his tweets speak for themselves. It is the working class of America, that makes this country move, not Wall Street stockbrokers, not real estate speculators, not hedge fund managers, not billionaires, not CEOs taking exorbitant compensation packages while cutting the benefits of workers. Workers have the power. That is the most clear sort of populist call to arms that you can have, right? Bernie Sanders very much saying we have to make these sort of changes for the people. And in the most recent time through, right, the 2020 election, Donald Trump did the same thing in 2016, very much used these populist frames But I'm going to suggest that in 2020, Donald Trump's campaign looked a little bit more like Andrew Jackson's campaign did in 1832. Was that it looks a little more nationalistic with a lot of its tone. So we're looking at crises in 2020, right? We've got immigration, which again is an issue. But whether or not immigration is a true full-blown crisis in 2020 is up for some debate. I'll say sure, immigration is a crisis. But one thing I think we can all agree was most certainly a crisis in 2020, COVID-19, right? That there was a cold going around. And so this certainly shapes how the candidates ran for office, right? The messaging they used. So for Donald Trump in 2020, a lot of his campaign promises and a lot of this messaging to deal with these crises very much espoused this underlying nationalism, building a border wall, immigration bans from certain places, travel bans, the Muslim ban, travel bans from China after the pandemic. Withdrawal of international deals, so getting renegotiating NAFTA, pulling out of the Paris climate accord. All of this is this nationalism, right? This nationalist ideology being framed as the people being oppressed. So the quote down here, and this is Donald Trump talking. This is Donald Trump talking about this label of nationalism. They have a word, it's sort of become old-fashioned, it's called the nationalist. And I say, really, we're not supposed to use that word. You know what I am? I'm a nationalist, okay? I'm a nationalist. Nothing wrong, use that word. He's not afraid of that label, but he doesn't use the word nationalist when he's talking to normal people. He says, hey, the people need this. The elites aren't letting us have it. It's us versus them. 2020 obviously wasn't just Donald Trump. There were other folks running. So Bernie, I can't get enough of Bernie, right? Billionaires and huge corporations should not be allowed to use loopholes and tax havens to avoid paying their fair share. At a time of massive global inequality, the very wealthy should be paying more in taxes, not less. Clear, huge corporations, this valorization of the people, evil corporations. Elizabeth Warren, I don't do a good Elizabeth Warren. America's middle class is being hollowed out, and the working families and poor people are being left behind. What we need to talk about, though, is why that has happened. And the answer is we've got a government that works great for those with money and doesn't work for much of anyone else. So Bernie and Elizabeth Warren in 2020 were both espousing these democratic socialist ideas. But if you look at their tone, it looks pretty similar. It's us versus them. Steve Bannon, also the pictures over here. I found pictures of Bernie and Elizabeth Warren with megaphones, and I had to Photoshop in Steve Bannon's megaphone. It was just that OCD to me. But Steve Bannon, this is in 2020. He says the Democrats, the longer they talk about identity politics, I got them. I want them to talk about racism every day. If the left is focused on race and identity and we go with economic nationalism, we can crush the Democrats. Again, these underlying ideologies, they're in the driver's seat. This populist rhetoric is what's being sold to us. It's the vehicle that's being used. So then we look forward. What happens next? Who's it going to be? We don't know what 2024 is going to shape up like. Now, mind you, this populist rhetoric is used in all sorts of elections. So it'll be used in 2022, it'll be used in 2026. For the purposes of this study, we're looking at presidential elections. So what's it going to be in 2024? Is Donald Trump going to run again? There are a lot of indications that he will. Will Donald Trump Jr. run? There are a lot of indications that he will. I think Saturday Night Live and a lot of the late night hosts hope that he does. Josh Hawley, Senator Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Elizabeth Warren, Mike Pence, The Rock has floated getting into the race. Who will be the defender of the people? Who will take up this mantle of populism, right? Who will be that figurehead? And in 4 years, what crisis is it going to be? What's that motivating factor going to be? Is it going to be the battle over voting rights? We're seeing this playing out in the Senate right now. Will things change before then? Will something give? Will it be race issues? The Supreme Court just ruled in a couple cases about qualified immunity. Is that going to set off another firestorm? Right? Infrastructure. It's been infrastructure week for about 30 years. Is infrastructure still going to be an issue in 2024? Is the pandemic still going to be an issue? I feel like this mask has sort of molded to my face. is there going to be something new? We don't know what the crisis is going to be in 2024. So we don't know how candidates are going to try to deal with it and how they're going to talk about it. And so the question that I have here is, what's the ideology that's going to drive the next election? Is it going to be liberalism? Is it going to be conservatism? Is it going to be a return to nationalism, a nationalism 2.0? What ideology is going to be in the driver's seat moving forward? I'm honestly not sure. The rockism, maybe a new thing, right? And in this new battle, who is us and who is them? Is us the American people, or is it a smaller subgroup? Is it people of color that have been disenfranchised by these voting rights laws? Is it older folks that are sick and can't afford health insurance? Is it disaffected whites who feel like the country has left them behind and they're looking for a champion to return things back to a more traditional sort of standard America? We don't know. Who will be them? Who's the enemy going to be next time? Is it the government? Is it corporations? Is it Anthony Fauci? Is it Hulk Hogan? I'm just assuming The Rock is going to run. I'm not sure. Who's going to be them? Who is going to be the enemy next time? Because what we know is that it's useful. When you talk about us versus them, when you can frame your ideology as a battle between good versus evil and you represent good, that's really useful. That's a powerful political tool to have. And when you control how you deal with a crisis, or if you can even help to create a crisis and then control it, that's really useful. So this rhetoric matters. And beyond that, we see that this rhetoric can turn into governance. We can turn it into policy. Donald Trump in 2016 ran against NAFTA. He ran against a lot of these international agreements we were in. He turned that into actionable policy as president. He issued executive orders. He pushed for legislation. He did stuff that actually got done. And so my I guess, warning or caution to you is that it's not going anywhere. And that in 2022, 2024, and beyond, you're going to see a lot of messages about us versus them and how us is good, them is bad. And there's this crisis that's going to move us. I would urge caution to think truly about who us is, who them is, and what the underlying ideology behind this language is. Because language is powerful, but the ideology underneath it is what could make the language potentially deadly. And I had to put this in here because I'm talking about populism as a vehicle for other ideologies, and you can't get much better than literally a car with Bernie Sanders all over it. That is literally a populist vehicle. And so with that, I will turn this back over to Scott, and we'll open it up for any questions or comments.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation. And do we have any questions?
It's a little long, apologies.
I got a question. There you go. Hey.
Perfect. Hey, great.
So are there any candidates who aren't populist?
Yes. So as a matter of fact, and this is sort of an extension of the work I did in my debates project, you can look at different candidates with different backgrounds, and some have a much harder time at making this populist claim. So for instance, candidates that have been in Congress for a really long time have a hard time making a credible populist claim as an outsider. So for instance, like in the presidential debates, if you've been a congressperson for 36 years, it's hard for you to say, hey, DC is the problem and I'm going to run against it. It's like, you've been for 36 years. So when you look at different candidates' backgrounds, you do see that there's variation. The ones that are truly outside of government use this rhetoric more. But yeah, across the board, it's useful. Yeah, it's powerful. So they try to use it, but some are have more credibility than others.
So so this is an unrelated question, appreciate that, but I've always heard the term populist used in a pejorative sense, right? Yes. So you talk about my candidate, it's just a populist candidate, or they're being populist or whatever. But you seem to indicate that it's being used, and I see what you're saying, that it's being used in right, to candidates' benefit, right? They're using this language while in some sense denying that they're populist, or at least many of them have. Maybe Sanders is an exception there. But can you speak to this kind of negative use of the term and how they characterize it as a negative trait?
Yes, and that's actually a great question, Greg. So if you look at the literature in populism, it's dominated by European populism, heavily, heavily dominated by European populism because it's been more prevalent there. And so the pejorative use of populist really comes from that European populist that does have a lot of negative connotations. So in the United States, there's a group of scholars that are sort of trying to pull back that negative connotation about populism, because populism as an ideology, which is what a lot of people think, is negative, because people say this is what you're talking about. This European populism is negative. It's bad, right? But that's if it's an ideology. As a discursive frame, what a lot of scholars argue is populism can be used for good or bad. Populism is just a way of talking about things, right? So populism can be used as a frame for talking about ethnic cleansing. Populism can also be used as a frame for talking about giving people universal health care. So I think that's kind of the difference, is we take it away from thinking of populism as this bad European creeping oppressive force, and think of it as like, this is a rhetorical frame that candidates can use for their underlying ideology, which can be good or can be bad. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's just like any other tool. It can be used for good or bad, I guess.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for the question.
I have a question, and
yes, sir.
Also from a historical standpoint,
yes.
And history, there's a school of thought, a kind of a meta-narrative school of thought known as Marxist school of history, where it's there's a constant struggle between the ruling class and the ruled, and vice versa. There's this constant struggle for power and wealth against one. And a lot of times when I see a lot of this populist rhetoric, regardless of where they're coming from, it seems very much a Marxian sort of point of view, because you're talking about us versus the elites. I mean, that's Karl Marx, isn't it?
Right. Yeah, and so that's what makes European populism interesting, looking at it like American populist frames, is because kind of what Greg was talking about a second ago, you don't have American politicians saying, oh yeah, I'm a populist. Because we even have enough knowledge to go like, oh, that doesn't sound good to say I'm a populist. But what you say is, I'm a champion of the people, right? So you never really have Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump come out and say like, well, it might be a Marxist idea, but I believe that the people have rights. They would never actually allude to that. But the ideas that both Democrats and putting out, you're absolutely right. A lot of this is Marxian, and it's framed in, hey, it's us versus them, eat the rich. So it's common themes, but what American politicians do is put it in terms of things like liberty and equality and freedom, these American ideals that like the people can latch onto. So I guess that's the difference. It is very much a Marxian idea, but we say, hey, here's some Marx, but it goes down really easy with apple pie.
Yeah, but with you say it as a discourse, but it can still be very dangerous, can it not?
Absolutely. Yeah, so because it can be used, I would say, as a vehicle for insidious ideologies, right? So populism as a discourse can most certainly be dangerous if the ideology underneath it, like nationalism, is calling for something like ethnic cleansing, right? Because essentially what you're able to do is use that rhetorical frame to mobilize people to do something pretty terrible. Yeah. So both good or bad, I guess. And I think that's a lot of the scholars trying to claw back the positive aspect of populism, is that it can be used for good things. Populist messaging can be used for things like expanding healthcare and, addressing inequality. So that's, I think, comes a lot of the sort of conflict in using that word.
I jumped in, Jarrett, but I actually have a comment on that.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, I was at the faculty senate meeting, so that's where I was. I wasn't ignoring you. But I would say that it's more than Marxian, it's Hegelian. And Marx is a form of Hegel. Because Marx kind of took, he's a young Hegelian. So it's really more of a Hegelian idea, which isn't as insidious as Marxism, but you can, it doesn't have that materialistic bent to it, but it still has kind of the us versus them dynamic to it, in the idea that you're trying to create a thesis and antithesis and combine them. But that's what I would say. And then again, that just comes because, I read about Wilson, so I know I've read a lot of Hegel.
Yeah, no, that's actually a really good point, because in a sense, it kind of goes with one of the 5 key elements of a populist messages, which is that it's simple, right? Marxian Hegelian, I will never say that right.
Yeah.
It's complicated, it's nuanced, right? Understand those things. Whereas this populist rhetoric is just what you're talking about. It's us versus them, and that's all that matters.
Right.
Yeah, that's all that matters. It's us, good, them, bad. All the other details, now we'll figure that out later. So that's a really good point. I have to reread that. So,
Are there any other questions or comments?
I have one. Thinking about that us versus them aspect there, I guess I'm wondering, like, how important or unimportant as it seems is authenticity in that. What I'm thinking is, like, so much of the populism you're talking about is kind of wealth-based populism, but then we look at the people pushing the arguments how are they not the elites themselves when they're billionaires in at least one case?
Right.
And so I guess that I'm not sure where the question is. Kind of, it's a comment of, it's interesting they can pull that off, that I'm one of you, but also how important is authenticity, or how often do politicians get called on it and punished for trying to pretend to be part of us?
something they're not. Right. No, that's an excellent question. Thank you. So yeah, when we look at the us versus them thing, there are other elements besides just economics, right? Because a lot of it is class. For Bernie Sanders especially, it's class, right? The top 1%, bottom 99%. Very much. That's how things are split up, is class here. But it doesn't necessarily have to be us versus them based on class. So I would actually say, looking at Donald Trump in 2016, now Donald Trump is somewhere between a thousandaire and a billionaire. We don't really know, right? But he's rich. It's difficult to go and say, hey, I'm one of you, the normal people, just normal Joes with a normal $1 billion. So you can't do that. You can't make that claim. So Donald Trump can't go and say, I'm one of you and say I'm middle class. Donald Trump can go to a group of people and say, I'm one of you and be one of them, right? And so if you look at a lot of Donald Trump's messaging, especially in 2016, it is sort of talking about this us versus them, more like traditional nationalistic. It's us, the good white Americans, versus them, the immigrants coming in with bad ideas, bad intentions, the murderous rapists, things like that. So I think in that sense, he makes the claim, hey, I'm one of you, not in the sense that, you know, I also eat a McDonald's. Well, I guess he also eats a McDonald's, but not in the sense that I'm just a normal middle class person, but hey, I look like you. So I think a lot of those folks try to make that claim that way. To your other question, do politicians get called out for trying this populist stuff? All the time. And it's so sweet to watch. I mean, Hillary Clinton, for instance, in 2016 in the debate, right? Hillary Clinton's been around politics forever, and Donald Trump called her on it. Joe Biden, the same respect, is saying, listen here, I'm going to do things for the people. Has been there a long time. I mean, any politician that's been around a long time gets called on it, Democrats and Republicans. It doesn't keep them from trying to do it, though. They're shameless, those politicians. That's an awesome question. I really appreciate it.
Are there any other questions or comments that you'd like to make? Well, if not, thank you so much for an exciting and interesting conversation, very revealing. And that is it. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.